Hi, welcome to the Femme Futurists Society. And I'm Nancy Giordano, and have founded this with my co-working partner, Emma Pezak, because we were so excited about these futurists that are getting more visibility, but and curious about each other's work, right? Some of us were listed in the various article, but even so, we're like sort of behind the scenes having these conversations and exploring each other's thinking. We thought it'd be more interesting to make those conversations visible. So thank you. And Heather, as we just started, like, it's the first time we get to lay eyes on each other, but I have been following your work for a very long time. We just discovered we have, what, 121 shared connections?
Yeah, so far.
So we're definitely influenced by and influencing very similar people. And it's extraordinary to have this time to be able to spend with you, getting to know more about you and your work. So thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
So in introducing yourself, I feel like people are always better at introducing themselves, and we always end up with these like interesting descriptions of who we are. So how do you describe yourself in the world?
I'm curious. I am extremely fortunate. I get to live a life of real privilege combined with some gratitude, because I realize my fortune. I, at the moment, am focused on the future of work, but I don't know what'll come after that.
Well, the future of work is a really broad topic. So describe a strategist, speaker, writer, author.
Yep.
Any other parts that you put into the story?
Daughter, spouse, friend, all those things.
There you go. Perfect.
Because sometimes, especially in a world of virtual work, we don't have the walls up where we're suddenly like, I'm just a speaker right now because your dog's walking downstairs, your mother's text messaging, we're all
totally
blending right now. So and I think that's a really cool thing for identity, because as I mentioned in the book, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, we've gotten stuck in this occupational identity trap that I think is really preventing people from adapting and growing and thriving.
100%. Yeah, I've been anti-titles for a very long time because I worked with an AI startup, and that was one of the big things that got in the way. We brought on all these senior people who had all this great credential, and they wanted to be, everyone was a C something or other, startup people of 20. And there were some roles that needed to shift, and people were so hung up on the, the hierarchical description of the work, as opposed to where it is that they could really have been a really tremendous use, and so I've just been anti all that. As roles, I think, are great to identify. Titles, not very useful.
I mean, if you look at really what we do, we ask little kids what they want to be when they grow up. The world's never moved as quickly as it does right now. We ask university students to pick a major before they step foot on campus or dial into Zoom. And that has huge social mobility implications, because you pick what you know, and that means you are limiting your sphere. And then we tell them not to take anything outside of that major. When we
don't let them, right? I mean, you and I have had this, wonderful contributions back and forth on LinkedIn around the future of education and the real miss there is there. And I've got these 3 kids that are in the middle of it right now. One is finishing a master's, one is in university. So we'll be paying for his apartment as he's doing his classes online. And my daughter, who's a senior in high school, who's now starting this whole process again. And she's, the way I describe it is the world keeps crumbling right behind her. Right? She's at the very last end of the old school of this. Yeah. And so like the last to take the SAT test, and the last to have these kinds of crazy exam schedules, and the last to try and like do this college application stuff. And it's like they apply to these programs that ask them to be very, very narrow. And my middle son really wanted one that would have more diversity, found one that sort of does. But poor Harper is really like struggling with this like major issue and having to decide it at age 17 when who knows?
What was your degree in college, undergraduate?
Mine, it was a double major of psychology and economics.
Okay, do you use that?
Well, yeah, actually I do, because, I was a liberal arts student. I got really lucky and went to a liberal arts school. And so these were not like super STEM oriented, even though they sounded so. And so, yeah, to this day, I would argue the curiosity that led me to that blend is the curiosity that still feeds my work today.
Yeah, that's the right approach
to figure it out.
Like my undergraduate degree is in industrial design, which is basically product design. I did that for a decade, but I use design thinking every day. Right. But we're preparing students, and I saw this increasingly when I worked in university for about a decade, to assume that their first job is going to be their last job. At a time where their first job may last 18 months, it may last 3 years, the debt's going to last 20.
Yeah.
And we're asking them to rigidly put these blinders up. And the first thing we ask each other is, what do you do? And studies have shown that job loss takes longer than the loss of a primary relationship. Mm-hmm. Because the loss of everything that you are, and that's preventing adaptation. So I'm anti sort of, so what do you do kind of questions.
Well, I think here's the thing. I will say that I found that the various cities have their various version of that question, and East Coast is very focused on that. right? When you come to Austin, which is where I am, and I moved from the South. I grew up in Atlanta, then New York, Chicago, LA, now Austin. The question of what do you do has nothing to do with your work. It's really, what are your hobbies? What is your outlet? What is your thing? What is your, like, where do you contribute? And it took me like, a full year to figure out how to answer that question in a way that wasn't tied to just my work or my role as a mother. And so I do think it's a little bit different around, and I do think that some of that stuff is shifting. But to your point, the fact that these things are changing, I had this wonderful opportunity with my daughter for her to meet a board of directors for an organization that was for healthcare, women in the healthcare industry that were not physicians. So the Healthcare Women's Business Alliance. And we went to this board dinner, and each of them introduced themselves to my daughter with their career journey. And it was fascinating to see someone started in community health and now has ended up in a startup. Someone ended up in nuclear medicine and now she's doing something with drug development over here. Someone started in pharmacology and ended up working in media or marketing over here. Like, it was just, and sometimes it was because life threw them a curveball, right? And they had to adapt. Sometimes it was because they got married, moved to another country, couldn't practice. Sometimes it's because they just got burnt out and needed to move to another thing. Sometimes they just got curious. So there's so many different reasons that people make that zigzag that I thought it was so great for a 17-year-old to be able to hear that. Because they really do believe. We did a career fair for the future for college and high school students, and the number one question is sort of like, how did you decide and how did you know?
Yeah.
And they got to hear again stories of that, that zigzag. So what is yours? What is your story?
Industrial design undergrad, worked in baby products, sporting goods, medical products, and then I was asking too many business questions. So they said, you really shouldn't ask those questions, so you go get an MBA. Went got an MBA. Met somebody who introduced me to someone, started working in social and responsible investment banking and boutique M&A work. Then had lunch with somebody who said, your undergraduate institution really needs your type of design business thinking. Went back, and that led to a decade in higher education. And then started writing articles because I was completely frustrated between, I had corporate clients and academic clients that nobody really saw the shifts that were taking place, and they had taken place as far as I could tell. And that was like 10 years ago. My second article on LinkedIn went viral, and 100,000 people read it in a couple of days. I started getting speaking requests from all over the world, and then that just snowballed to here.
So how much of your time is speaking versus any other work that you do? Is it all speaking, or do you do other?
Almost all speaking, yeah. I do a little bit of bespoke consulting, and I do some writing.
I think what's interesting, there's luxury to your point of being a speaker, the privilege, I should say, of being a speaker, is that you get to hear where so many people are in this journey, right? Yep. The part that I find so fascinating about the work as a strategist, because I really come at this as a strategist first, who then has this opportunity to speak, is that when people tell me, well, this is where we are, right? We've had this really tremendous year, or we've had this really difficult time. There was one time in the same week, I would hear almost in the same day, analogies of, or metaphors, whatever they are, we're putting the wheels on while we're racing the car. We're trying to fly a plane while we're, in the air, or while we're building it. We're trying to cross the bridge while we're building it, literally using the same kinds of language, right? And so to hear the vulnerability each time, because they want us to be successful as speakers, they want to give you the whole lowdown, is so amazing to hear over and over and over again, right? It gives you a really great insight into where organizations are.
And everybody wants me to tell them somebody else knows how to do it, and I can just give them the playbook.
Oh my God, that's so perfect. So, I am finishing my first book, which I'm finding to be kind of a challenging experience to write a static thing in a dynamic world. Mm-hmm. And so I keep wanting to go back and fix it. And we were about to launch it right before right in March. And then certainly the world changed. And so we've held out for a while, and I actually got really quiet with it and sat with it for a while. But that was exactly the premise, is the idea that we cannot have a playbook. In my belief, and I'm interested to hear yours, my belief is everyone's asking for the new chapter in the playbook. Like, where's the new piece I can just slot into the binder? And I'm like, there just isn't one anymore. And so it's really about teaching people to move from a playbook to a practice, right? How can I have a compass and a North Star? So your passion around purpose is a big part of what we describe as the North Star, right? As an individual or as an organization, as an industry even, how you're able to guide and navigate your work in real time. And that's why I think, again, your book is so perfect and perfectly timed to help people understand that. So do you want to talk to what inspired you to write this book right now?
Yeah, so the book came out in April. I would not recommend launching a book in the middle of a global pandemic. But if you're gonna do one, something called the Adaptation Advantage is pretty well suited for the moment, even though it wasn't written for the moment. So I started speaking full-time in 2016, 17. And at the end of every talk, somebody would be like, oh my God, that was so much information. My mind's blown. Do you have it like somewhere I can take it home and read it and think about it? And so I just listened after, I think it was like my last 100 talks. I listened to all the questions people were asking and what was resonating most with them. And I collaborated with my co-author, Chris Shipley, who's a far better writer than I am, who can take everything I sort of go like this with and sort of turn it into beautiful prose. And we collaborated together and wrote this book called The Adaptation Advantage. And there's just like, it's very simple. It's that, you know, we're really focused on lunging at skills and using this model of codifying and transferring in terms of education and screening people for jobs based upon, you know, past skills and experience, and creating hierarchical structures where we focus on, you know, as John Hagel says, scalable production, scalable efficiency rather, when we're in a world of a dynamic change where we need agile and adaptive thinkers to work in a world of scalable learning. So in order to do that, we just sort of say the future of work is learning. In order to learn, you've got to let go of how you used to do it and who you think you are. In order to lead in this new normal, you've got to be comfortable being wrong, failing, and being vulnerable. And all those are the antithesis of the way we've built up to this moment. So the last industrial revolution was all about scalable production, command and control, codify and transfer skills to create a deployable workforce. Our whole education system is working that way. So in this moment, it's really one of the other things I've discovered recently, another way to say it, is we've been so focused on what is the skill, when the reality is we've got to focus on how do we build the will, because we're going to have many skills.
That's
so I say we once learned in order to work, and now we need to work in order to learn continuously.
I know, again, I do love the way that you have some of these phrases, right, that help people then kind of like, it does codify it a bit.
Yeah.
You know, in fairness, I have not had a chance to read your book yet. I wish I had it here and I could like put it on my little shelf here, but I will get it. But I did hear you describe it, and you talk about it in thirds. And what I thought was really beautiful about the way you describe it is the first third really sounded like there's a lot of empathy and helping people recognize that they already have been through a significant amount of change, right? And the confidence that comes with that, which certainly, again, has been amplified during the last 3 or 4 months. But even prior to that, we did have a lot of learning, right? We did,
and we've risen to the challenge, and that's, I've talked to my publisher about it. So for our second printing, we'll probably do some reworks for the virus. Because if you look at the first 2 weeks of the virus, every learning organization from K-12 to corporate learning to universities went all online, like literally overnight. And after working with university presidents for a decade who told me this faculty member won't teach, or that faculty member won't teach, or this course won't translate, boom, done. After working with so many senior executives, you say, yeah, I'm not really comfortable from people working from home, boom, done. And people are thriving. And so people have done a tremendous amount of adaptation in a very short period of time. And you got to give yourself credit and a break from it.
Well, to your point, I think there was a certain amount of like a bit of adaptation that we were already getting when we just figured out how to figure out mobile, and we figured out social, and we figured out freaking internet for people who are a little older. So I think that people think that it's so scary now, and like you have actually been through waves of this before. It just didn't happen quite as fast as it's happening at this moment. And I think to your point, the fact that we all jumped in it at the same time, you know, certainly made it so that you could learn from one another, be more vulnerable, figure out like the fact that everyone's got a cat that walks through the thing and everyone's got a child, you know, so there's just a lot more relatability than I think if we had done it piecemeal. And so you and I were just starting out that conversation talking about how fast we think that we've accelerated. So do you think it's 5 years? Do you think it's 7, 10? Like how fast do you think that this has thrown us into the future?
At least 5 and maybe 10.
So here's the question I have though, because I agree with you. I think we're somewhere in that range as well, but it's not all been successful, right? So I have been one of these people who has been also advocating for many years, become more adaptive, become more sustainable, become more human, right? Become more digital, less hierarchical, whatever. And so we have seen these big jumps, but where do you see some of the breakdowns? Because I think that I think once we sort of take our, you know, a deep breath and we realize, wow, there were so many things that we were afraid of that we've actually managed very successfully, but there also have been some breakdowns. And where do you think the breakdowns are?
I think that's one of the things you have to think about it. Think about it like you're just starting to exercise after sitting on the couch for 20 years. You know, you're going to pull a muscle, you're going to do too much work one day, you're going to lift too much, you're going to do something that hurts. But that doesn't mean you stop doing it or it was bad. And so there's going to be lots of places. Like one of the questions is, you know, like I just saw an article in I think it was the Times that New York has gone to phase 3 or 4. Because I was in New York until March, and then I moved to Boston where I have a home. And I got out of New York just as the pandemic was. Actually, Austin was one of the last cities I was in. That was one of my last stops. But even though they've opened up for people to go back to offices, only 8% have gone back into offices. So is it still fear? Yeah, probably. Is it childcare? Yeah, probably. But there's also the question of why. You know, what doesn't work this way? And there's tons of stuff that doesn't work this way. But if we start getting really specific around, you know what, we need to be in the office 1 day a week, 2 days a month, we'll figure out what it is and we'll figure out why we need to be in the office. Exactly. Why do we need to be in the same space? What are the things we're trying to do? And I think that's going to be an important thing that we figure out over the next probably 6 months to a year.
Well, I think the key part of that is this idea that I call status fluid. The fact is that we will be in the office some days and not in the office some days. We will be we will be sort of a contributor, but not necessarily a full-time employee. We will be learning at the same time that we are doing. Like, I feel like again, back to your comment about labeling and roles, like you just put a thing on Twitter, which I'm going to put on LinkedIn later because I think it's great. It's about Siemens' work from home policy. And again, we're not really working from home. We're living from home and lifing from home right now. So I think it's also kind of an unfair assessment. But in this moment where we are trying to do all of our things from home, the idea that they'll go to the office 2 to 3 days a week, it doesn't have to all be one or the other. We'll make space available for that, right? So I think that's part of the adaptive conversation and mindset that needs to happen, is that it doesn't have to be these rigid rules of all this or all that. It's not binary.
Right. And, you know, if you hired people and you can't trust them to work at home, why did you hire people you don't trust?
Well, here's what I realized is we've talked about culture for a long time, corporate culture or cultural cohesion inside organizations and shared values and all that sort of thing. This is where I think it really matters, right? I do think that when you understand what you're doing and people are there because they're engaged and they're excited about it and they feel like they're part of it and they can contribute and there's ways for them to do it. I don't think it's just about the employee. I think it's about the system in which it is that they are invited into and how well it supports them. Do you have the tools so you can do your thing? Can you collaborate with your coworkers? Do you have access to those people, right? Do you feel heard? Do you have, so I do think that there's pieces of that that contribute to being able to be successful in an environment. It's not just the policy. Do you agree?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that Chris Shipley and I wrote an article, it's part of the book too, but we wrote an article a few years ago and said, companies have focused on, brand and product and all these sort of externalities, which are really outputs. If they focus on their inputs and say, this is our culture and this is our pursuit of pursuing our capacity, this is why we exist, these are how we do things, then there'll be lots of what's, so that you would join an organization based on shared values and shared learning goals. And you'd go on these learning tours with a company until you say, you know what, I've reached my point where I've done enough learning here, I've contributed enough here, and I'll go somewhere else. And that creates a much more dynamic, agile, adaptive environment that's constantly scanning the horizon, able to adapt to your business model. So you're not focused on the what. When you're focused on the what, you're sunk.
But I think I totally agree. And right, sometimes that what or that paradigm is tied to a locale in which I work or the health insurance in which I'm offered or whatever. So when those things can be untethered from the choices that I get to make, and I get to do those in a way in which I do have more of the fluidity, or the freedom of fluidity.
Yep.
Right? And so again, that's part of the thing that I think is accelerated. The insurance thing is still a nightmare. We're independent. I don't have a corporate insurance policy, and somehow figured it out. Went to Google best plans for freelancers or independent contractors. And so I get frustrated when we end up having this big, huge conversation around this stuff, knowing that there are solutions to this problem. But I do think, at least on the work side, the cool part is that we get to now level out some of that geography, right?
And use more of the country, live where you want to live, let's revitalize some of these rural towns and secondary cities, and let's bring culture to new places, and, let's de-densify a little bit.
So what do those locales need in order to be successful in attracting the workers of the future, right? They need a certain amount of broadband connection, because we're seeing that is not equally distributed.
Certain amount of broadband, access to food and culture. You want to be able to get organic foods. You want to be able to get good quality education, even if that maybe even be decoupled, from.
Yeah, I think that actually there's a freedom there. Again, I was having this long conversation with a friend of mine about what we think is going to happen in fall and the whole starting with school. And I was watching my daughter at the end of spring, and she's got one of the best physics teachers in the state, if not the country, potentially in the world. Like, we are super lucky that we have these husband and wife physics teachers in our program that just turn out amazing students. And she's doing one of her lectures from her garage, and she's got her chalkboard in there because she doesn't like a whiteboard. And she's doing her thing. I thought every student should see Mrs. Masage's lecture. Why is only my daughter and the small cohort of people in this really, wonderfully lucky neighborhood getting a chance to see her learning? Like, it seems like, this should be the kind of thing that becomes much more available. And the rockstar teacher in language arts, and the rockstar teacher in Spanish, and the rockstar teacher in something else. Like, I don't think it should only be that there's 10 rockstar teachers, because there are different styles, but I definitely think that there is going to be a giant rethink about how we get the information that we need and how we get coached then. Like Emma, who you met briefly at the beginning, my colleague, has got 2 younger boys. And so they're thinking about the whole, like, how do we hire the, the tutor slash coach slash whatever person who can either supplement their online stuff or tutor them during it. Like there's this whole micropod learning thing that's happening right now, and teachers who are actually in a quandary as to whether or not to go back to the school district and try and deal with all the crazy there, or get hired by families who can afford to do that, which again, some families can and some families can't, right? So there's just such a, I think I believe that the education is the biggest, airlines and education are the 2 biggest kind of people have to rethink what's going down because of the pandemic.
It's a tremendous, tremendous opportunity to unleash a whole lot of human potential.
Yeah, so if you were going to advise, I guess the question is, where would you want to advise? Would you want to advise at the college level, the high school level, the if you're like place that you want to create like the biggest shift in intervention that we can make right now to help build what we think needs to.
I've done a lot at the university level, and it was always just like an exercise of banging your head up against the wall, because you spent most of your time trying to undo what was done in the K-12 system, because the K-12 systems become this sorting process, decide who's going to university, and track them to get into the right university. So they're only learning things that matter to get you into the university. There's this whole will it be on the test thing. So it's undoing all of that. So if you could reach back earlier, I love what the Khan Lab School was doing, which was, organize kids by independence level. Everybody works through competencies. Everybody has a passion project, and everybody's a teacher and a learner. Start there. You're just building agency. You're tapping into curiosity. You're building towards purpose. And you're not focused on what level you got on this, and only these skills are important and these aren't. And you start to really unleash that human potential, and then you carry that through. I'd love to see that.
I'm seeing that certainly. I mean, we've been watching this for years, right? Especially as I was also trying to figure out how to educate my children over the last 25 years. But I feel like it's growing, right? The whole self-directed learning and thinking about this differently. What percentage of students do you think get an opportunity like that? If you had to guess, I mean, it's totally conjecture, right?
Less than 1.
5?
Less than 1.
Oh, less than 1. Wow, I was going to say less than 5. So there's a lot of, opportunity. And I do think that, even when it was first exposed to me many years ago, when I was with actually Jerry Mikulski, who I believe you know, and with one of the people that was in his community. And it took my brain a little while to wrap around it. And I think I'm a pretty fast learner. I like to think about new ideas and new concepts. But I was like, I don't want to be responsible. I just want to be able to drop them off and have it all figured out over there. Like, too many choices. Like, what do you mean about pedagogy and yada, yada, right? But at some point it becomes really clear that that is going to be the wave of the future, and figuring that. And then agency for kids. I mean, I had a talk last week with a woman who runs Insight and Foresight and Innovation at L'Oreal, Sarah Davanzo, who's phenomenal and such a curiosity champion. Like, she really feels like it all starts there, that we need to continue to cultivate it and, and have it be expressed as much as possible. Because when you kill that, you sort of kill everything. And so I do think that that's a big part of what the current education structure does poorly, right? Even my daughter, who will have graduated from a very demanding, kind of rigorous, old school place. I mean, we ask her what she's really passionate about. I mean, she can tell you.
Yeah, I mean, because it's bent on telling you what you're not good at, and telling you where you should and shouldn't play, and what matters in the world, which has nothing to do with what matters to you.
Yeah. It's a weird, I mean, Emma and I again had this conversation because she's definitely orienting her boys more in that direction. It is hard for me to break away from the fact that my kid had to take a certain number of APs and had to, because you get caught up in that cycle of, in order for her to get into the school, in order for her to get into the blah, 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 right? And so I want this game to change so badly. I want autonomous cars. My middle son doesn't drive yet because he just keeps waiting for the autonomous cars to eventually get here. And so unfortunately we're stuck in this, and that I do think is the gap. We talk about this liminal gap between old systems are breaking down and new systems have yet to be created. And we're in this sort of gap sometimes. And it is challenging to know how to orient in the gap. How do you advise people to?
Yeah, I mean, in my own experience, I just was really lucky as a child. They kept taking my IQ test because my grades weren't matching up with my potential. And I was just like, I'm not that interested in this. And so my parents would finally start taking college classes when I was in high school, and they just, had that ability. I don't know how we do that for folks now, when the system is so oriented towards, screening out people and screening in people, as opposed to helping people light their own fire. that's the focus. I think that, the external motive, Dan Pink proved that in 2009. External motivation is limited, internal motivation. So why aren't we all focused on how do we light the fire in folks? So we get that internal motivation, because you're going to have to learn and adapt for life. You're going to
Let's
have
talk about
to.
this pushing far out, because I totally agree with all that. And I think that we and I could have a long, I can say glass of wine, but shots of tequila around the frustration of the things that haven't gone well so far. But the great news is, because I am not living in under the fear of the illness or immediate financial pressure around it, I have this luxury of being able to look out on the horizon and being able to see what's there and hold the space for that. So, and we did talk about the fact that aside from the very, very real pain that I think we're about to even experience much more greatly in the next 6 months to a year economically, it does create at least this opportunity to rethink things. And I think education is probably the most, overdue for it and the most change. So again, as we start to imagine the adaptation beyond school, because I agree that I start to think about what kinds of, I guess I, 4 questions at once, sorry. There's the future of work, which is literally how we express ourselves on the planet, whether it's being unpaid, right? And then there's how we work, which will include whether it's augmented or not augmented, and whether it's full-time or not full-time, or whether it's all these other pieces. And then it's how we see ourselves and how we think of ourselves as being valuable on the planet, right? And they're sort of tied together in those things. So when you look into the far horizon, and I don't know how far you allow yourself to gaze, Heather, because sometimes it gets really frustrating if you look too far out and you see the gap between here and there. But I do imagine a society in which work itself looks really, really different, right? And so how do we build that path between here and there? What are some of the really key pieces that you think need to be laid for that to be a good?
I mean, we can't ignore the fact that we're in a pandemic. So we have let's face it, a leadership void in this country when it comes to dealing with this pandemic. And fortunately, businesses have stepped up. And, when a business like Walmart says everybody wears a mask, then suddenly Starbucks, McDonald's, and everything, and suddenly we have a national mask policy. We need that kind of approach, and maybe business leads us out of this, which would be really interesting, where they say, work from anywhere, no degree, we interview you in a different way, we want to attract cultural alignment and your pursuit of expanding your capacity, as long as we are going to expand our own capacity as we look to new business models. That's the future I see, but I see the need for us to stop and say, we've been through a lot. We've been through a lot in the last 4 or 5 months, and you've done a tremendous job. Parents out there, thank you. Thank you. The parents who are dealing with their own children, their own children's education, elderly parents, sometimes fears of the virus, economic uncertainty. There's a lot on humans right now. So the folks who are out there, like, if you didn't come out of this learning Mandarin, you wasted, or something like that. We don't need any of that shaming. We don't need any of that shoulds. What we need to do is thank people for what they're doing right now and say, give yourself a break. We probably have another 6 months to a year to 2 years till we get, vaccines scaled up. And in this time, it would be a mistake not to learn from what we're doing right now. Like, for example, these technologies could be telling us something about our behavior. So if this is the Femme Futurists Society, if I worked for a company and I'm the only female in the group, and in meetings, I used to come out of in-person meetings saying, I always get cut off and I don't get to speak as much as everybody else. They would all tell me it's my perception. We now have the ability to use the technologies we're using to communicate to actually track that. Why aren't we doing that? That could make us more aware of our behavior. So there's lots of learning we could be doing right now, whether it be about how we address each other, how we regard each other, our unconscious biases, our microaggressions. All of those things are possible because everything we're doing is leaving a digital exhaust right now. And we have this opportunity to learn and grow from it. So that's one thing I could see us doing.
That's a really, really cool idea. I was just saying aside, there was work that was done out of Microsoft Research with Eric Horvitz and Jamie Pennebaker around some of this stuff, and they were looking at it. But to your point, they had to collect the data by going and recording meetings and trying to do it in a much more cumbersome way. And now you're absolutely right. We have all this.
Like think about the last debate where I think at the Democratic debate, they would say, Elizabeth Warren spoke this much time and Kamala Harris spoke this much time and Bernie Sanders spoke this much time and Joe Biden spoke this much time. And this person interrupted that person. We get all of that information just from the recording of a Zoom. And somebody build it. I've been saying it out there. Somebody build it and send me a periodic royalty check and I'll donate it to somewhere.
No, definitely. I think that is, and actually, I met somebody recently, right before the pandemic, one of my last talks in New York, with a person who has built a business where they're recording patient and doctor interactions. Because I think mostly probably from an insurance perspective, they want to make sure there's some sort of record in the middle of that conversation around whatever. But we were talking, and he got excited about the AI implications of being able to do all the linguistic analysis on this to understand, when somebody they're asking these many questions, it means you haven't actually really listened to them, or you've misdiagnosed them, or they're about to tell you something and you didn't. Like, there's a training piece to it, there's a diagnosis piece to it. Whole thing. I thought it was so stunning that he had this ability and he wasn't optimizing it yet, but it could, right?
Yeah, and making doctors much more aware of when they're not listening and when patients aren't understanding, because it's like, I did some research, medical research on one of my consulting projects, and it was like, discharge from the hospital, if you treat the patient, you speak with the patient when the caregiver is there, you get much fewer revisitations to the hospital. Simple stuff.
Yeah, right. That seems like
people are listening, two people are asking clarifying questions. So there's an economic piece that's tied to this, and once you do that, then you get a lot more people interested in it.
No, I totally agree. Okay, so that's a huge idea. I love the idea that we would be able to use all of this and be able to become better at communicating and understanding where, again, the mythology meets the reality around any of this.
And we all have an opportunity to grow. I'm sure I'm interrupting you at some time, or I'm not listening in some way. Absolutely, it's not just picking on the white guy, which I think happens a lot, and sometimes with good reason, but there are all ways that we're doing things that we shouldn't, and not listening and not paying attention, and we could speak differently.
Or to your point, where we are or modeling other behaviors. I was on a call again with a bunch of clients that I'm doing a talk for, and we started talking about imposter syndrome. It came up in somehow in the conversation, and there was a white man in his late 50s who immediately was like, "Oh my God, I feel like that every day." And immediately was like, "Yes, can we please make sure that we include that as part of this presentation of 2,000 people at this big CPG company?" And I thought, how cool of you that you just said that in front of 8 people on a call.
Yeah.
Your coworkers, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't like you're just having this little conversation with me as a, kind of a confidential therapy thing over here. Like, it was like, you were like, yes, let's lean into that. When I did the prep call with them yesterday, they're like, "By the way, you mentioned something about the imposter thing. I didn't see that in your slides. Can we really talk about that?"
Yeah.
I was like, that's awesome. So I also want to say we are moving into this territory where I think we are becoming much more empathetic. We are becoming much more vulnerable. We are becoming more aware of each other's things. You at the beginning, when I asked you how to sort of identify yourself, I was on a call with someone the other day, and he went through this, like, I'm white, I'm male, married but non-binary. Like, he went through this whole story about like those parts of him. I said, it's interesting. I will introduce myself to you this way. I think like an analyst. I have the heart of a mother, and I have the soul of an artist. So depending on, how you approach me, depending on whatever moment, you could get any one of those 3 people. So just letting you know. But that's the kind of awareness that I think that we're going to get more sensitive to, right? Is that there isn't just this one way of interacting with a person. There's one way that vulnerability looks, or strength looks, or courage looks like, or caring looks like. I think we're just going to get much more sensitive to that. And that's the kind of thing that I think that if we were able to analyze even this conversation, we'd see what trust was built here, and relational, connection was built here, and that led to such and such, which led to blah, 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 or a missed opportunity. I'm with you. I just think it's not all the negative. We're learning some really positive.
Yeah, like one of the things I point out in the book, that research from Alice Reynolds and David Lewis is the teams that learn the fastest in VUCA environments have a combination of psychological safety and cognitive diversity. So you got people who think differently, but you're establishing safety. And our next question obviously becomes, because the pandemic hit, how do you establish psychological safety in a virtual environment? Don't know yet.
Do you know your answer? I haven't. It's storytelling, right?
Maybe, but it's that may be how you express it, but how do you know how it's being received? How do you know how it's being built? There's research, I think, to be done.
There is work. I mean, well, there is, but there's also research that we can pull from. Parker Palmer has done a lot of this work already. The former Surgeon General of the United States, Dr. Murphy, I think, has done a lot of this work that showed that literally if you just start meetings with a 5-minute story, right? And it could be something that it's vulnerable. Like Google did a bunch of that work through Project Aristotle, where they found if you told like a more vulnerable story, right, you would learn this. Or Harvard did this also for brainstorming. So it depends on how much people know each other, don't know each other much. I'm willing to tell you my most embarrassing moment, or I can just tell you about my coolest Halloween costume, right? Or the bucket list vacation thing I want to do, or you start to get a little bit more intimate. There was work that was done actually, again, in the Surgeon General's office when he was forming his office in DC, and they decided that in each weekly team meeting, and this was done in real person, but it could be done as easily remotely, that they would give each person an opportunity to do a 5-minute story about themselves through photos. So you pick like 15 photos, you can tell people about yourself in a 5-minute presentation. People loved it, Heather. People looked forward to that so much each week. And because of that, trust was higher. People volunteered for assignments and helped each other more. Learning, was accelerated. All those things that we put in as really big business tasks that we need to make sure that people have were a result of just remembering to be connected to one another, right? And this is one of the things I really do think that the Zoom world, because we've now gotten to see our environments, we've gotten to see our families, we've gotten to see our, I went to go close the door during a conference call with a client. I forgot that I had on like gym shorts, right? And it gave me like I was going to go like work out later. I'm like, oh, right. I looked so like professional from here up. And I forgot. But that's the cool part about the place that we're in, is that we get to have much more of this, I think we're ramping up our relational intelligence, like pretty significantly. And that I think works really well. It gives us courage as we move forward. So again, I just started this conversation saying this, we can wind it down here, but if this had happened 10 years ago, we would have been in a world of hurt, because we wouldn't have had so many of these both technologies and practices already. And the companies that already had done any work from home or had done any leaning already into some of this were certainly better prepared than the ones who hadn't. So if we were going to say the same thing, like God forbid something like this would happen 20 years from now, what are the capacities that we will imagine will be at our disposal then?
Before I answer that, I just want to first say we have to acknowledge the privilege that we're both in, because there are families where, they're in a 2-bedroom apartment, everyone's sharing a computer. There are people who work in grocery stores, deliver packages, drive Uber, where work wasn't dangerous before, but now they need personal protection equipment that they can't get, and tests they can't get, because I went for a test this morning, negative. But the process is one that we have to acknowledge how much privilege we have. So we have these conversations about it's not so bad for us. I'm going to get off this. I'll go walk my dog. My life is pretty goddamn great. But I understand how much it sucks for a lot of people right now. So
that to me should be part of the equation when we start talking about 20 years from now, right? I think that this whole idea of leveling the playing field, I talk a lot about slope, that we've got a slope problem and it needs to be leveled, right? That is a big part of it. So access to, reliable education and broadband or support or healthcare or food or safe environment or just environment. Like those are, I think, are parts of what we hope that we will have gotten smarter and more thoughtful and more committed to, hopefully in the next 10 to 20 years, right?
Yeah, I mean, even in this moment, in the fall, nobody could imagine $15 an hour. And now Amazon and Target are paying like 18. In the fall, we didn't want to pay for anybody else's health insurance. But now if I get in an Uber and that person's sick and they're still working because they don't have sick pay, suddenly I care about that Uber. So even the most selfish person in the world in this moment, pandemic has done some wonderful things to make you aware of others in a way, because I think we have a me-we problem. We have very much had a me approach when we understand that we're actually much better when we have a we approach, whether it's education, income inequality, access to healthcare. It makes all of us stronger, because it's not sustainable, the me path we were on.
Well, so then the big portion of this that we haven't discussed at all yet, which I think usually comes up in this conversation, then to avoid even more and more of this bipolarization, which we had as we walked into this. And yes, there's empathy now, but we're also seeing so much of the cracks of people who have access to either the job or the skills and the technology. So training, we start to think about reskilling and skilling. We talked about education and the role that it can play. And I love your comment on LinkedIn a while ago. We talked about the fact that higher ed feels like they're only like targeting between 18 and 23. And the fact is that there's a whole population. There's an entire citizenry that needs to have access to that. But you start to think about the role of skilling and reskilling. There are a couple of thoughts. One is the ability of everyone to be able to do this. Two, whose responsibility is it? Who pays for it? And then how do we as individuals prepare ourselves for the fact that this is going to be the requirement moving forward?
That's where education becomes a foundation and more of the will over the skill, like helping you figure out what you're interested in. So you get your own internal flywheel going and you get a sense of the things that you're good at, and that starts directing you towards experiences. And then companies want to invest because it makes more sense to reskill your population continuously and retain that tacit knowledge and just upskill the explicit knowledge, rather than, spill and fill, which is what we've been doing, to tragic consequences in some cases. So I think those things that people kind of say like, well, who's going to pay for it? And that's always sort of like, well, let's back up for a second and let's not assume this context and who's going to pick up the bill. But let's back up and say, what could we become if we thought about it differently? And so humans are not a cost to contain, they're an asset to develop if we look at them correctly.
All right, so should be the alternative. How should we think about it?
How should we think about what?
Well, I mean, you were just saying that if we apply like the who should pay for it through this lens, what is the lens that allows us to think?
Education becomes less about how do we sort who's going to university. University is to get to a degree. That's you could throw in the career letter's gone. Learning is now for life. So how do you set up somebody to learn for life? That's what our education system becomes. Work and learning are a combined act. So you're hiring people who align with your values and who want to pursue expanding their own capacity along with you expanding your capacity. So you're on a learning journey. So that's a different screening process. That's a different process of nurturing employees for that scalable learning world versus the scalable efficiency world. That's also a different leadership approach. That's leaders who are leading teams from behind on learning tours as opposed to top down on just driving productivity out of them. So that means the leader wants to be vulnerable and learning and establishing trust, totally different. So different context for education, different context for screening, different context for leadership.
Got it. Well, we could wrap it there, but I do always love to ask the question about what it is that you're passionately working on right now. You finished this book, you're talking a lot about the work that's in the book, you're thinking about the sort of the pandemic lens of it, but as you look to where it is that your curiosity as such a curious person, what questions are you curious to answer now?
Well, there's a couple of them. One, I have been looking at the difference between tacit and explicit knowledge. So explicit knowledge can be codified, so it can be transferred without a human. Tacit knowledge needs either experience or experience with another human to generate it. Tacit knowledge is the most valuable knowledge in an organization. So how do we think about that in an organization? How do we generate new knowledge? How do we turn, when we can, tacit knowledge into explicit knowledge? So that's one area I'm working on. The other one is, why do we come together? Other than in technology. So say the virus subsides, ebbs, whether it's through, runs through all of us because we're just completely incompetent, which seems to be the path we're on at the moment in the US, or, therapeutics come up, so we just learn to live with it, or a combination, however it subsides in some way so that we can come back together again, which I love speaking live and I really miss that. So I look forward to doing some live talks at some point in the future and going to a ball game in the movie theaters and all that kind of stuff, dinner parties. That subsides outside of social stuff, outside of sporting events, outside of talks. Why do we come together in a place for work? I mean, it used to be because we were physically doing things together, but now that almost all work is going to be knowledge work in some form or fashion, why would we gather in a space together? What is it that we can't do virtually? And what is the things that we can't do virtually that technology will catch up so we can do them virtually? And when will we decide to come together? When Airbnb was first launching, and I think WeWork was first launching, there was this idea that everybody would work from home and that you would meet up in different parts of the country or different parts of the world at set periods of time. And that would build all the social capital and trusts and all that kind of stuff. And that would allow, people to have all these different cultural experiences. Maybe that'll emerge. Who knows?
Again, I'm an empty nester in a year. And I think a lot about where in the world do I want to work and what I want to do. And this idea of remote year, which is a program that takes you like by month to a different country, and you can hang out with 50 other people who are interested in doing the same kind of thing. And they like sort of do all the logistics for you, but you can do your work from anywhere. I like that. Like just keep going. That sounds like fun, right? And you posted recently about the places around both the country and around the world that are luring remote workers. It's happening all over the place, and so it's really fascinating to kind of imagine the where we will gather and how we will gather, and the role. Like I think that VR and AR are going to play a huge role in that, right? When I can put on my goggles or I can do my environment however it is, and I somehow feel as though I'm actually having a more engaged experience with you, will I be less reliant about wanting to be in a physical space with you, but then want to make some other arrangement to go, to your point, have a dinner party instead, because that's the part that I can't replicate. So yeah, I think it's fascinating. I do think about where we will be 20 years from now, and again, the head start that we have to get there, and hopefully the additional empathy with which it is that we get to build that, because that was the part that I was really worried was missing prior, and then I think we've gotten a really good shot at developing now.
Yeah, Warren Buffett says when the tide goes out, you find out who's swimming naked. And he said it to talk about like what business models are broken in a raging economy. You can't tell. But I think that that's what's happening right now. We're realizing, we're suddenly recognizing frontline workers. I walked my dog one day and I saw "Thank you, bus drivers" written in chalk on the sidewalk. And it's like, well, why didn't we always think that?
I know.
My COVID test got all screwed up today. So I went over to Starbucks and got a gift card for the folks who helped me out. And they're like, wow, thank you. And I'm like, we should be thanking you guys all the time. Everyone's screaming at you under so much stress right now. You just made an impossible situation for me easier.
Yeah, the kindness. This goes back to the idea of not just empathy, right? About being really, really kind and more aware. For me, one of the most, like, it was such a duh when I heard it, but I was like, oh my God, we're all in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat.
Yeah.
And having empathy for that, and to your point, helping and figuring out where our resources can be best deployed. There's the immediate, and then I just think again about the systemic. And I'm always, again, excited to be able to have these kind of conversations, Heather, because they get me to think more about where it is that we can each apply. I mean, I subscribe to your belief that each of us has a purpose and a drive and a set of unique curiosities that we get to deploy. And so I am constantly on the scanning where it is that can add the most value. So
you never know what it might be. Like I was just telling you beforehand, I just got back from this RV trip. I went down to Florida with my sister to pick up my parents and my brother, who's very immunocompromised, and bring them back. And my brother is a cancer survivor, stroke survivor, heart attack survivor, all tied to his childhood cancer. His trouble walking. He can't drive. He can't do anything in the van. But I voted him MVP because no matter what happened, he'd be like, it's not so bad. This is okay. Like he had the best attitude. And so sometimes it may be somebody's purpose to make everybody else realize how lucky they are.
100%. Or just that they really, I mean, I've taught my children to always look at who really loves their work and who doesn't. And they've seen it across anywhere. We went to a family camp once, and the guy who served breakfast every morning just loved saying good morning to everyone and making feel really good when we walked in. I'm like, he loves his work.
Yeah.
Like, he's really good about what he's doing here, right? And then we went to some place in Vegas in some really like rundown hotel buffet, right? And they're watching them do made omelets. I'm like, he loves his job.
Yeah.
And then we went to a Dairy Queen once in Mexico, and this woman could not have been more surly and more miserable. I'm like, man, that ice cream tasted really bad. It was just like, but it's like you want them to see that it's not about the level of the job or how often they do the job or they get paid for the job. It's just whether or not people feel like they're adding value, right? And they're feeling like they get to be them in that work. And that's the thing you always wish for your kids, for sure, and what you wish everyone in society had the opportunity and the privilege to be able to go do. And that's what I think a lot about on this horizon. I don't think the idea that there will be this kind of idea of essential workers, I hope shifts, and the fact that there is no dangerous, dirty, horrible job, demeaning job. And we get to figure out a way to have everyone have a quality of life that that is right for them.
Yeah, I remember one of my first jobs, the second in command at the company, it was this startup. He was always in a bad mood, and he was always raging at people. For some reason, I had a great relationship with him. I'm not sure why. But one day he was raging at people, and I was like, God, Mike, seriously? And he goes, how do you think I feel? I can't ever get away from myself. There's some insight.
There you go, self-awareness. You give yourself cool props for self-awareness. And I do think, again, when we think about the shifts, right, we go from like, I believe that this idea of being performance-oriented, performance metrics is going to shift to awarenness metrics.
Yeah.
We're going to think about who, your point, is adaptive.
Yeah.
Right? Who has a sense of self-awareness and who has a sense of wanting to, figure out these various bits of it that will be required and move forward. It's a really, really different way of assessing how we get through this. So thank you again for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Today. We will let you know when it's up and running. I do feel like we need to timestamp these days. It's July 20 something because the world, well, who knows where the world will be tomorrow. But as of today, I think we got a really good sense of it. And say hi to Chris, because Chris was one of our very first TEDx Austin speakers. One of the very first TEDx speakers in the world, because TEDx Austin was one of the very first ones that got a chance to do our thing. And she bravely came to some nascent thing and didn't know what any of it was about and jumped in there with us. So I was a very warm spot for Chris. We haven't stayed in touch, but.
Is that when she did her Peloton talk?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good one.
So anyway, I appreciate that she jumped in, and I appreciate you, and thanks for all of it. And now when we see each other on LinkedIn, I will give you an extra wave. And I do hope that, we get a chance to see each other in person someday too. I do. That's the part I miss. I don't know if I miss being on stage as much as I miss being able to go explore a city. I need sensory input.
Yeah.
And quality thing that we don't not rushed in a call with someone. You get to sit with a glass of wine and just really get to know them. So
yeah, my second to last talk was in Austin, and I landed just as South by Southwest had been canceled. Everybody was leaving, and
March 13th, I can tell you that date.
yep, I was there.
Oh, wow. Well, I hope you get a chance to come back. Right now would not be a good time.
Yeah.
No one gets to come to Texas right now until we get our shit together.
Yeah.
But I do hope at some point that we will be able to welcome people back, and I hope you'll come back. So thanks.
I look forward to it.